All right, I am here with Abri Aucamp. Abri ran a publisher yield team in Europe for many years, focusing on digital media. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the differences in publisher yield between North America and Europe. So, Abri, welcome. Thank you. And when you think about the top 2 or 3 differences between Europe as a geography and North America and how it pertains to running a yield management team, what are the 2 or 3 top things that you think about?
Thanks, James. I think it's worth saying agencies are definitely more prominent across European countries than in the US. Of course, the regulations are very different and makes for quite a different approach. And then somewhat obvious, but definitely very important, is Europe is not a single country. It's not a single market. There's each of the countries have their own peculiarities and differences that you need to take into account.
Thank you. All right, let's drill into those each a bit. If we start with agencies, as you mentioned, they have relatively more power in Europe than in North America. What are the implications for that when you, as a publisher, might be dealing with an agency, and how you need to structure the relationship, respond to their requests, etc.?
So agencies are going to control a significant amount of the budget that you're going after, meaning that your relationship is not only with the advertiser, but you need to have a good relationship with the agency, rather, because they are going to decide whether or not you get a part of that budget. Likewise, you really need to know your agency to know which budget you are going for, because there are general agencies like Group M, or there's more specific agencies like Astus that only have access to barter budgets, and you will need to transact accordingly. Very important for a pricing team is to try and find a partnership with the agency, rather than seeing them as you should really try not to have a confrontational relationship, but try and work with them to get mutual benefit for the publisher and for the agency, and ultimately then for the advertiser as well.
And when you think about the relationship, usually these get structured as like some kind of annual agreement for some period of time, and then you want to create incentives for the agency to work with you as a publisher. What do those incentives look like? Because agencies traditionally might have demanded cash. I know in some geographies, cash may or may not be allowed anymore, so you have to think about other mechanisms. So how do you think about those sorts of mechanisms from a yield perspective?
So, as you say, cash rebates is the traditional way, and it's definitely still very important in many markets, especially, for instance, in Italy and Spain. But then, as you pointed out as well, it's not allowed in some markets like France, where you have to have also your relationship between the agency and the advertiser is different. But equally, agencies, as they have had to share more of that with the advertisers, and as the business developed and became more programmatic, they're looking for new forms of incentive. And it's really for the pricing team to find ways that they can work with, such as principal buying, where the agency buys some of your inventory and then resell it in packaging that they set up, or to find ways of creating value for the agency in other ways, be it through training programs where you train their staff on your systems, and thereby also be able to incorporate some of your inventory, or even through things like guaranteed outcomes. The bottom line really is to find a solution that is workable for the agency, so that they have enough of a margin on for themselves, but also that allows you to really monetize your inventory.
Got it. All right. Well, you mentioned regulatory, and when we talk regulatory, we're often talking privacy, where Europe is, one could say, either more advanced than the US, certainly further along in the discussion. And when GDPR came in, I know it caused European teams to look at a number of different things as to how to respond to GDPR and privacy in general. It's certainly a different environment from the US. How have you thought about that in the past? How have you worked with yield teams that have had to respond to the privacy environment within Europe?
So GDPR, when it came in, had an immediate and quite significant impact on the addressable audience that you have for any kind of audience-based buying. Something like the reject all button in worst cases have up to a 50% reduction in your addressable audience. So you have to work with the product and privacy teams in order to make sure that that workflow for consent is clear and understandable and as efficient as possible, so that users feel comfortable to consent and give you the ability to actually use that data. That makes that can have 20 to 30% of an impact. And then you need to find other ways. You need to be innovative and look at ways like contextual targeting, or to augment with any other data sources that you have, like logged in users, or find a different way of monetization, like subscriptions. But contextual targeting, probably one of the better ones, or one of the other more acceptable way of identifying users are all ways that you can implement.
And just finishing off on this question of how to think about GDPR, there are differences in how it gets implemented by different publishers, because while there is a law that's relatively black and white, there's a lot of areas that are open to interpretation in terms of how you ask the users for their user information and their consent, and at what stage of the process. Just talk to me a little bit about how that continuum can be played differently for different publishers in terms of how aggressive or risk averse they might be around those types of questions.
Exactly. So the law is very clear on you need consent, but it's not clear on the mechanism for consent, or it doesn't prescribe it. So it was something for the industry to sort out for themselves. You have publishers that is happy to go with what is called legitimate consent, purely by saying, I need this in order to transact my business, and therefore almost force the user into it. And on the other side, you have very explicit consent for everything in between. You also have a form of contractual consent, where the mechanisms, all the pipework in the background might not be there. Then you basically contract with whatever other partners in the industry that you're working with, that they certify that they only give you data for which they have consent. Now, all of these have some issues. Even the full consent framework route has been challenged, like the IAB framework in the past. So there's a lot of work to sort that out. And without going into too much detail, something like the IAB consent work framework, the TCF framework, with modifications to comply with the Belgian rulings, is probably the safest way, while something like legitimate consent will probably fall away in the end, and will not be acceptable, I would be my suspicion.
Excellent. You mentioned that a mistake that many people from North America and Americans from the US in particular make is thinking about Europe as sort of one market similar to the US. Obviously, it's different languages, it's different countries. As you're thinking about organizing and managing a pricing and yield type function, what does that practically mean in terms of how you might have to organize the work and organization of the team?
So what we found best is, because each market has its own nuances, and you really have to tailor your pricing for every market, and also your approach to both the sales team and to customers and what they expect, like levels of discounting, pricing, how that pricing is presented. I found through the years that a market-based approach worked best. So basically have a dedicated pricing contact for the sales team to work with. If there's a very technical or more a specific area that needs more expertise, you can have a functional head, like somebody who focuses on the trading aspect across the markets, or somebody, say, focusing on programmatic advertising across the markets. But it's good then to have them work with the market-specific lead as well, so that there's always one person that is responsible for helping that sales team and the customers in that market. Also very important is that person has a secondary market, just so that you get that cross-pollination, that cross-training, and then with all of our holidays and things like that, you're also set in that there's always more than one person that can deal with any market.
Got it. And just one point of clarification, because you used a term I think that is not common in the US, which is trading agreements. And some people might argue that programmatic is a form of trading. But when you use the term trading, you're talking about agreements like with agencies or potentially major advertisers, correct?
That is correct. Sorry, yes. When I say trading agreements, this is like annual trading agreements. I think in the US, you will have agreements like that more on an advertiser basis. Here in Europe, we tend to have it more with an agency, but either locally within the country or with the holding companies across Europe.
Excellent. Well, Abri, there is so much we could drill into, and I feel like each one of these we've touched on only briefly. We may want to do a deep dive at a future date to do a really deep dive into each of these topics. But I think those are the three main differences between Europe and the US. Thank you for the time. I'm going to call out to anyone who finds this type of content useful. Please subscribe to the channel, and please request of me other guests like Abri that you'd like to see in the future. Abri, thank you so much for the time, and I'm sure we'll talk again later.
Thank you, James. Lots of fun.